What if the biggest power shift of the 21st century isn't happening in Washington, Beijing, or Moscow, but in the quiet boardrooms and diplomatic back channels of Southeast Asia? Because right now, while the world is distracted by tariff wars and military posturing, an entire region is making a calculated bet on a new global order. And the West may not see it coming until it's already done. Act 1. The meeting that changes everything. The morning air over Rio de Janeiro carries something heavier than humidity. It carries consequence. As sunlight breaks over the city's iconic skyline, diplomats, finance ministers, and heads of state from across the developing world are filing into meeting rooms with a shared sense of purpose. But this isn't your standard diplomatic gathering with rehearsed photo opportunities and carefully worded joint communiques that nobody reads. Something more substantive is taking place, something that has been building for years, quietly, deliberately, and now, undeniably. This is the BRICS Summit, and its agenda this year is nothing short of reshaping how the world organizes power, money, and influence. Now, if you've heard the name BRICS before and mentally filed it under geopolitical noise, you're not alone. For years, the grouping was easy to dismiss. A loose coalition of large emerging economies, Brazil, Russia, India, China, South Africa, that generated ambitious rhetoric but produced few concrete results. Western analysts often described it as a talking shop, a place where leaders went to express solidarity without actually building anything. But that description no longer holds. And the country whose quiet moves at this summit deserve the most attention isn't one of the founding five. It isn't China with its economic muscle or Russia with its defiance of Western sanctions. It's the region that rarely gets top billing in global power discussions, Southeast Asia. A collection of nations that has spent decades mastering the art of strategic patience. They're done waiting. Act 2. How BRICS became something real. To understand why Southeast Asia's repositioning matters, you first need to understand how BRICS itself transformed from a financial acronym into a genuine geopolitical force. The term was originally coined in 2001 by Goldman Sachs economist Jim O'Neill, not as a political project, but as an investment thesis. He was simply identifying four large economies, Brazil, Russia, India, and China, that were expected to dominate global growth in the coming decades. South Africa joined later, rounding out the five. In those early years, the grouping's annual summits were often overshadowed by skepticism. Critics pointed to deep ideological differences between members, territorial tensions between China and India, and the absence of any real institutional framework. What could this group actually build together? The answer turned out to be quite a lot. The new development bank, established in 2014, became the first concrete proof that BRICS could move beyond symbolism. Headquartered in Shanghai, the NDB began financing infrastructure, clean energy, and urban development projects across emerging economies, offering something that institutions like the World Bank and IMF had long struggled to provide: financing without the political conditionalities that often felt more like leverage than support. That distinction matters enormously in the developing world. When a government in Africa or Southeast Asia approaches the World Bank for a loan, it often comes bundled with requirements: structural reforms, austerity measures, governance benchmarks. These conditions aren't always wrong, but they are frequently experienced as intrusions on national sovereignty. The NDB offered an alternative: capital without strings that felt like a leash. Then came the expansion that genuinely turned heads. In 2023 and into 2024, BRICS extended membership invitations to a new wave of nations: Egypt, Ethiopia, Iran, Saudi Arabia, the United Arab Emirates, and most significantly for this story, Indonesia. With that expansion, the coalition's collective share of global GDP, measured by purchasing power parity, crossed a historic threshold, surpassing the combined output of the G7 for the first time. Read that again. A grouping that was once called a talking shop now represents more economic weight than the United States, Germany, Japan, France, the United Kingdom, Canada, and Italy combined, at least when measured by purchasing power. This is no longer a fringe movement. This is a structural shift in how global economic gravity is distributed. Act 3. Indonesia breaks the seal. Indonesia's formal entry into BRICS was the moment that transformed Southeast Asia's relationship with the grouping from theoretical to tangible. The world's fourth most populous nation, Southeast Asia's largest economy, and a country that has historically positioned itself as a leader of the non-aligned movement, Indonesia's decision sent a clear message to its neighbors. This door is open, and walking through it is no longer controversial. Jakarta has been careful to frame its membership not as a turn away from the West, but as an expansion of engagement with the global South. Indonesian officials have consistently emphasized that joining BRICS is about securing additional channels of financing, strengthening trade ties with fellow emerging economies, and ensuring that Indonesia has a seat at tables where development frameworks are being designed, rather than simply receiving their outcomes. But the ripple effects across the region have been significant. Malaysia, Thailand, Vietnam, and even the Philippines have all deepened their engagement with BRICS-related initiatives in recent months. None of this is happening loudly. There are no dramatic press conferences or symbolic gestures. This is the Southeast Asian way, methodical, pragmatic, and always keeping options open. Malaysian Prime Minister Anwar Ibrahim, who also chairs ASEAN this year, has been among the most vocal regional leaders about the need for the global South to assert itself. He has spoken openly about what he sees as structural inequities in the existing international financial order, the dollar's dominance, the governance imbalances in multilateral institutions, and the way geopolitical loyalty is often extracted from developing nations in exchange for access. His government's decision to extend an invitation to Russian President Vladimir Putin for upcoming high-level meetings in Kuala Lumpur, a bold diplomatic step that will certainly raise eyebrows in Washington, reflects just how far some regional leaders are willing to go in demonstrating their commitment to genuine non-alignment. Not symbolic non-alignment, not the kind that quietly defers to American preferences, the real kind. Act 4. What Southeast Asia is actually looking for. So, what specifically draws Southeast Asian governments toward BRICS? The answer isn't ideology, it isn't admiration for Russia or China, it isn't opposition to the United States, it's architecture. Two institutional mechanisms in particular explain the appeal in concrete terms. The first is the new development bank itself. For governments in Southeast Asia that are navigating massive infrastructure gaps, ports, railways, digital networks, clean energy grids, the NDB represents an additional source of project financing. The region's infrastructure investment needs are, honestly, staggering. The Asian Development Bank has estimated that Asia alone requires trillions of dollars in infrastructure spending through 2030 just to maintain current growth trajectories. No single institution can fill that gap. Having multiple financing partners isn't just convenient, it's strategically essential. And here's the part that doesn't get discussed enough. Access to multiple lenders improves bargaining power with all of them. When a government isn't wholly dependent on a single financing source, it negotiates from a position of strength. It can push back on unfavorable terms. It can protect conditions that matter to its own development priorities. Diversification isn't just financial prudence, it's leverage. The second mechanism is the Contingent Reserve Arrangement, or CRA. This is essentially an emergency financial safety net for BRICS members, a pooled reserve fund that participating nations can draw from during periods of acute currency pressure, capital flight, or financial instability. Why does this matter to Southeast Asia? Because the region carries a very specific scar: the 1997 Asian financial crisis. That crisis, triggered by a collapse in the Thai baht and spreading rapidly across Indonesia, South Korea, Malaysia, and the Philippines, devastated economies, and wiped out decades of development gains in a matter of months. When regional governments turned to the IMF for help, the assistance came. But so did conditions that many economists and policymakers later argued made the situation worse. Sharp interest rate hikes, deep cuts to public spending, fire sale privatizations of state assets. The experience left a generation of Southeast Asian policymakers deeply skeptical of over-reliance on Western-dominated financial institutions as the sole backstop during crises. The CRA, imperfect and still developing as it is, represents an alternative architecture, a regional and South-South safety net that doesn't automatically route through Washington. For governments that remember 1997, that alternative carries weight far beyond its current technical capacity. Act 5, the tightrope, China, ASEAN, and the South China Sea. None of this is without complication. Any honest analysis of Southeast Asia's BRICS engagement has to grapple with the elephant, or more precisely, the dragon, in the room. China is not merely a member of BRICS. In many ways, it is the engine of BRICS. Beijing has been the most significant financial contributor to the new development bank, the most aggressive advocate for BRICS expansion, and the country with the greatest interest in seeing the grouping's influence grow as a counterweight to American-led institutions. And for several Southeast Asian nations, China is simultaneously their largest trading partner and their most contentious territorial rival. Vietnam and the Philippines both have overlapping maritime claims with Beijing in the South China Sea, a body of water that sits at the heart of one of Asia's most volatile and consequential territorial disputes. The sea contains some of the world's most important shipping lanes, significant potential energy reserves, and fishing grounds that millions of people depend on for food and livelihoods. China's assertiveness in the South China Sea, island construction, Coast Guard confrontations, legal challenges to international rulings, has pushed both Vietnam and the Philippines closer to the United States in recent years. The Philippines, in particular, has expanded American military access to its territory under defense agreements that have caused considerable tension with Beijing. So here is the core tension. How do governments like Vietnam and the Philippines deepen engagement with a multilateral platform where China holds significant influence while simultaneously relying on American security guarantees to protect their territorial claims against Chinese pressure? There is no clean answer, and that is precisely why this situation is so diplomatically intricate. What these governments are attempting, and they are attempting it with considerable sophistication, is a kind of double-layered hedge. Security cooperation with the United States, economic and development engagement with BRICS, diplomatic relationships maintained with everyone, and genuine alignment with no one. It is a strategy born of geography, history, and hard-won pragmatism. Small and medium-sized nations that sit between great powers rarely survive by picking sides. They survive by being indispensable to everyone and captive to no one. Act 6. The ASEAN question. Within this context, the question of ASEAN's collective relationship with BRICS deserves careful examination. ASEAN, the Association of Southeast Asian Nations, was built on principles of non-interference, consensus decision-making, and what its members call ASEAN centrality. The idea that Southeast Asian nations should drive the terms of their own regional engagement rather than being pulled in different directions by outside powers. Those principles have served the bloc reasonably well for decades, but they also create a structural challenge when it comes to BRICS engagement. ASEAN's 10 member states have dramatically different geopolitical orientations. Singapore is a deeply integrated node in the global financial system, with close ties to Western institutions. The Philippines maintains a formal defense treaty with the United States. Myanmar is in the grip of a military crisis that has complicated its international relationships entirely. Cambodia has historically leaned toward Beijing. Vietnam balances between all sides while fiercely protecting its independence. Getting all 10 of these governments to agree on a unified stance toward BRICS is, to put it diplomatically, unlikely. A collective ASEAN application for BRICS membership, something that some observers have speculated about, faces nearly insurmountable internal disagreement. What is far more likely, and what is already happening, is continued engagement at the national level. Individual member states will deepen ties with BRICS institutions, pursue project financing through the NDB, explore dialogue partnership arrangements, and gradually expand the scope of their cooperation, all while formally maintaining ASEAN's posture of neutrality. This is the Southeast Asian approach to contradiction. Don't resolve it. Manage it. Keep multiple channels open. Let each government navigate its own path, and maintain the appearance of collective unity even as individual strategies diverge. It's messy. But in a region where geography forces you to live next to your most difficult neighbors, messiness has proven more durable than rigid alignment. Any discussion of BRICS in 2025 and beyond is incomplete without confronting the political reality of Donald Trump's return to the White House and, its implications for the entire architecture of global trade and finance. Trump has never been subtle about his views on BRICS. During his first administration, he was openly hostile to the grouping's ambitions, particularly any moves toward reducing dependence on the US dollar in international trade. He threatened sweeping tariffs against countries that pursued de-dollarization, warning that any nation attempting to shift away from dollar-denominated trade would face severe economic consequences. Those weren't empty threats. His administration imposed significant tariffs on several Southeast Asian economies, disrupting supply chains and forcing governments to scramble for economic alternatives. Vietnam, Thailand, and Malaysia all experienced real economic pressure during that period. Now, with Trump back in office and with an approach to trade policy that is arguably even more assertive than his first term, the stakes for Southeast Asian governments considering deeper BRICS engagement have risen considerably. Here is the uncomfortable calculation these governments must make. Is the long-term strategic value of BRICS engagement worth the short-term risk of provoking economic retaliation from Washington? There is no universal answer. It depends on each country's export dependency on the U.S. market, its domestic political environment, its existing financial buffers, and, ultimately, the risk tolerance of its leadership. What is clear is that this calculation is being made actively, deliberately, and with full awareness of the potential consequences. These governments are not naive. They understand exactly what they're doing, and the fact that so many of them are still moving in this direction, carefully, methodically, without fanfare, suggests that the strategic logic of BRICS engagement is compelling enough to absorb the risk. That itself tells you something important about how the global order is shifting. Act 8. The bigger picture: what a multipolar world actually looks like. So let's step back from the individual decisions. Indonesia joining BRICS, Malaysia inviting Putin, Vietnam deepening NDB engagement. And you can see, a larger pattern starts to emerge. We're living through the early stages of a genuine transition from a unipolar world order to a multipolar one. And well, unlike previous transitions in global power, which were often marked by dramatic military confrontations or sudden institutional collapses, this one is happening quietly, incrementally, through the accumulation of small sovereign choices made in finance ministries, foreign affairs offices, and development agencies across the global south. Every country that diversifies its financing away from Western-dominated institutions makes those institutions just a bit less indispensable. Every country that trades in currencies other than the dollar makes the dollar, a little less dominant. Every country that builds diplomatic relationships outside the traditional Western alliance network makes that network marginally less encompassing. None of these individual decisions is revolutionary, but in aggregate, over years and decades, they're reshaping the architecture of global power. The United States and its allies are not unaware of this dynamic. In fact, Significant diplomatic and financial resources have been deployed in recent years to offer alternatives. The G7's Partnership for Global Infrastructure and Investment, the U.S. International Development Finance Corporation, European development initiatives. These programs are real, and they're growing, but they face a credibility gap that's honestly pretty difficult to bridge. Decades of conditional lending, structural adjustment requirements, and instances where geopolitical considerations appeared to override development priorities have left many governments in the global South cautious about relying exclusively on Western institutions, even when those institutions are genuinely trying to improve. Trust, once eroded, rebuilds slowly, and BRICS, for all its internal contradictions and institutional limitations, has positioned itself as an expression of that lost trust being rebuilt differently, among peers, through South-South cooperation, without the conditionalities that feel like control. Whether that positioning will translate into genuinely transformative outcomes remains to be seen. The NDB still faces questions about governance, project selection, and its ability to mobilize private capital at scale. The CRA has never been tested by a major financial crisis involving a large member state. BRICS itself struggles with the fundamental tension between China's dominant economic weight and the autonomy of other members. These are real challenges. They don't disappear just because the political narrative around BRICS is compelling. Act 9. Southeast Asia's endgame. So, what is Southeast Asia ultimately trying to achieve through this careful, measured, deliberately low-profile engagement with BRICS? The answer, at its most fundamental, is sovereignty. Not sovereignty in the narrow legal sense. These are already independent nations with seats at the United Nations. It's sovereignty in the practical, operational sense. We're talking about the ability to make decisions about your own development path, your own trade relationships, your own financial partnerships, without being subject to pressure that narrows your choices to what outside powers prefer. For much of the post-World War II era, developing nations across Southeast Asia and the broader global South operated within a framework they largely inherited rather than designed. The Bretton Woods institutions, the World Bank, the IMF, eventually the WTO, were built primarily by the United States and Western Europe at a moment when most of the developing world was either under colonial rule or just emerging from it. These institutions have evolved over the decades, but the governance structures that give wealthy nations disproportionate influence have remained, well, largely intact. What BRICS represents, imperfectly, incompletely, but genuinely, is an attempt to build alternative infrastructure for a world in which countries like Indonesia, Vietnam, Malaysia, and Thailand don't have to accept a framework designed without them as the only available option. This isn't anti-Western sentiment. Most Southeast Asian governments maintain genuinely positive relationships with the United States, Europe, Japan, and Australia. They welcome foreign investment from Western companies. They value security cooperation with American military partners. They don't want those relationships to end. What they want is for those relationships to be one set of options among several, not the only game in town. That desire, for genuine optionality, for the practical experience of having choices, is the deepest driver of Southeast Asia's BRICS engagement. And it's a desire that is almost certain to intensify, not diminish, as the 21st century progresses and as the distribution of global economic power continues its ongoing shift toward Asia. Closing Rio and what comes after. As the BRICS summit in Rio de Janeiro moves through its agenda, communiques being drafted, bilateral meetings being held, declarations being finalized, the cameras will focus on the obvious protagonists: Xi Jinping, Lula, Modi, Putin's presence or absence. But honestly, the more consequential story may be playing out in the margins. It's in the quiet conversations between Southeast Asian officials and NDB representatives, in the policy briefings being prepared for governments back in Jakarta, Kuala Lumpur, Hanoi, and Bangkok, In the gradual accumulation of frameworks, relationships, and institutional connections that will shape how these nations navigate the coming decades. Southeast Asia is not loudly announcing a revolution. It never does. Its history is a long lesson in the power of patience, of keeping options open, of surviving between giants by being too valuable to discard and too independent to control. What is happening right now is not a dramatic pivot. It's something more durable, a systematic expansion of choices, a deliberate construction of a future in which Southeast Asia answers to its own priorities rather than to whoever happens to be most powerful at any given moment. The world is in transition. The rules that govern global power for the past 8 decades are bending under the weight of new realities. New economic centers of gravity, new technologies, new generations of political leaders who have no personal memory of the order that was built after 1945. BRICS is one expression of that transition. It's not the only one, and it's not a perfect one. But for the nations of Southeast Asia watching from the global south, it represents something they've long been waiting for, a credible signal that the architecture of international power is finally genuinely negotiable. And, in a world where everything is negotiating, the nations with the most options will write the best terms. If this video gave you a new lens for understanding what's actually happening beneath the surface of global politics, share it with someone who's still thinking about the world in Cold War terms. Because the game has changed, the pieces have moved, and the countries quietly repositioning themselves in Southeast Asia may end up holding more cards than anyone expected. Drop your thoughts in the comments and hit the subscribe.